All right, so we're diving into this big debate, Jenkins versus ArgoCD. And, you're probably here because you're hitting some roadblocks with your current CI/CD, or maybe you're just curious about all the hype surrounding ArgoCD, or maybe you just want to, sound super smart at your next team meeting.
Yeah, I think a lot of teams they hit that wall with Jenkins and then they just jump on the Argo CD bandwagon without actually like taking a step back and really seeing, is this the right fit?
Exactly. So before we even get into Argo CD, let's talk about Jenkins, like the OG automation server, right? It's
Yeah.
been the go-to for like forever for building, testing, deploying, the whole CI/CD shebang.
Yeah, Jenkins is like that that reliable friend who's always there for you, super flexible and just a ton of plugins. Like you can find a plugin for almost anything.
Right. But even reliable friends can have their quirks, right? I mean, you
Yeah.
hear about companies really struggling with Jenkins, especially as they scale, especially when it comes to Kubernetes deployments.
Yeah, exactly. Jenkins, it wasn't really built with Kubernetes in mind. It's
Yeah.
traditionally been very UI driven and,
Yeah.
manually setting up these jobs. And while they've introduced like pipeline as code with Jenkins file, where you can define your pipeline in code, it can
Hmm.
still be a little bit clunky when you're dealing with the dynamic nature of Kubernetes.
Okay, so picture this. You're a developer at a company with, thousands of other developers, and everyone's pushing code like crazy. Deployments are happening constantly. And suddenly Jenkins starts to feel like that friend who, you know, always shows up late and unprepared to the party.
Imagine trying to troubleshoot an issue in a pipeline that has hundreds of jobs, each one potentially relying on, a web of different plugins. Finding that root cause can feel like trying to find a needle in a haystack.
And then there's the whole plugin situation itself, right? Like
Oh.
having this massive library of plugins seems great in theory,
Hmm.
but it can quickly become a management nightmare.
Absolutely. You're constantly worrying about compatibility issues, security vulnerabilities, and just the overhead of keeping everything up to date. It's like juggling chainsaws while riding a unicycle. Exciting at first, but eventually you're bound to drop something.
Oh man, that's a scary image.
Yeah.
And let's not forget about that dreaded configuration drift, right?
Okay.
Because with Jenkins, you're manually configuring those jobs. It's so easy for your actual infrastructure to become misaligned with what you have defined in Jenkins. And that's when things get really, really messy.
Yeah, you're basically setting yourself up for a constant game of whack-a-mole trying to keep your infrastructure in sync with your, ever-evolving Jenkins configuration.
So we've painted a picture of Jenkins maybe not performing so well under pressure.
Hmm.
But let's be honest, there are a lot of companies out there that still rely heavily on Jenkins.
Yeah, that's true. And it's important to remember that Jenkins is a very powerful tool. It has a massive community, tons of resources, and for many organizations, it still gets the job done.
But as organizations grow, their needs evolve. The question becomes, is sticking with Jenkins, trying to, optimize it, patch it up, is that the right move? Or is it time to consider more radical change?
And that's where this new kid on the block, ArgoCD, enters the scene. So ArgoCD, it's taken the DevOps world by storm. It's riding this wave of GitOps. But is it really the silver bullet that everyone is saying it is?
That's the big question, right? I mean, we've seen how Jenkins can get bogged down, but,
Yeah.
switching to a completely new tool is a big decision.
Oh, absolutely. Before we just, jump ship, let's take a look at what makes Argo CD tick. So it uses Git as that single source of truth for your deployments. Every change to your app config in Git triggers an automatic update in your Kubernetes cluster.
So it's all about that like declarative approach we hear so much about, right? You define what you want your application to look like, and Argo CD takes care of the how.
Exactly. You basically write your desired state in these YAML files, commit them to Git, and Argo CD is constantly monitoring for changes. And if something goes wrong, it'll automatically roll back to the previous state that's defined in Git.
Okay, that sounds pretty amazing. But let's play devil's advocate here for a second. Let's say we decide to, stick with Jenkins for now. What are some of the biggest risks we face as our infrastructure grows, especially in a Kubernetes environment?
I think a major risk is scalability. As your team grows, the project grows. Jenkins can really start to buckle under pressure. Troubleshooting in a massive, plugin heavy Jenkins setup can become a full-time job.
And like we talked about before, managing all those plugins can turn into a security nightmare. Every plugin is a potential point of vulnerability.
Exactly. It's not just about keeping them up to date, it's also making sure they all play nicely together, that there are no unexpected conflicts or anything like that.
So we're basically stuck constantly patching and praying that nothing breaks. What about configuration drift? How big of a concern is that with Jenkins?
It's a huge concern. Because as your infrastructure evolves, it's really easy for what's actually running to kind of diverge from what you've defined in your Jenkins jobs. And that can lead to all sorts of, unexpected issues, and debugging it can be a real nightmare.
All right, so staying with Jenkins could mean facing, scalability
Mhm.
issues, security headaches, constant battles with configuration drift.
Mm.
What about Argo CD? Are there any hidden gotchas we should be aware of before we take the plunge?
Well, I think one of ArgoCD's biggest strengths, its tight coupling with Git, can also be a potential weakness. If your team's Git workflow isn't, super clean, it can create chaos in your deployments.
So no more committing directly to master.
Exactly. You need a well-defined branching strategy, strict code review processes,
Yeah.
a solid understanding of GitOps principles.
And it's not just about the technical limitations, right? Switching to a new tool like this, it requires buy-in from the entire team.
Absolutely. There's going to be a learning curve. Your team needs time to get up to speed with Argo CD's concepts and workflows. And, you need to be prepared for some pushback. People are naturally resistant to change, especially when it comes to tools that they've been using, for years.
So it's not just a matter of installing Argo CD and calling it a day. It's about changing mindsets, adopting a whole new way of thinking about CI/CD.
Right. And I think it's also important to address the elephant in the room, the hype. There's always this new shiny tool that promises to solve all our problems. How do we, as software engineers, avoid getting swept up in that hype cycle and making decisions based on buzzwords instead of, actual needs?
Yeah, it's tough.
Ugh.
Everyone wants to be on the cutting edge, right? But sometimes the best solution is the one that's boring and reliable, even if it's not the trendiest.
Yeah, I think it comes down to being pragmatic and evaluating your specific needs. Don't just chase the latest trends. Do your research, experiment with different tools, and choose what works best for your team and your project, even if that means, sticking with the old guard like Jenkins.
Okay, so we've laid out the risks of sticking with Jenkins. We've talked about the potential challenges of moving to Argo CD. But let's dig a bit deeper into the technical side now. What are some of the specific ways that Argo CD actually leverages Kubernetes to provide a smoother, more secure CI/CD experience?
So one key aspect is how Argo CD integrates with Kubernetes role-based access control, or RBAC. You can define granular permissions for who can deploy what and where, making sure that only authorized users have access to sensitive environments.
So that's a huge step up from relying on a patchwork of plugins for security in Jenkins, right?
Absolutely. And because Argo CD is designed for Kubernetes, it naturally takes advantage of other Kubernetes features like namespaces, network policies, providing, further layers of isolation and security for your deployments.
So we've talked about the security benefits. What about the actual deployment process itself? How does Argo CD make things, easier, more reliable, especially compared to Jenkins's more manual approach?
Well, Argo CD really embraces that whole everything is code philosophy.
Hmm.
So you define your entire deployment pipeline in these YAML files, which are then stored in Git. This not only makes your pipeline auditable and version controlled, it also allows for easy rollbacks and disaster recovery.
Oh, so if something goes wrong, we can just revert back to a previous version of our configuration in Git, and Argo CD will automatically handle that rollback process in Kubernetes.
Exactly. No more scrambling to figure out, which manual steps to undo or which plugin might be causing the issue. It's all neatly tracked and managed through Git.
This declarative approach sounds incredibly powerful, especially for managing these complex deployments in dynamic environments like Kubernetes. But one concern that often comes up is the potential for vendor lock-in. Is Argo CD too tightly coupled to Kubernetes? Does that limit our options in the future?
That's a valid concern, and it's important to acknowledge that Argo CD is very much a Kubernetes native tool. However, the beauty of Kubernetes is its extensibility. There's this massive ecosystem of tools and services that integrate with Kubernetes. So even if you decide to move away from Argo CD in the future, you're not locked into a specific vendor.
So it's more about embracing the Kubernetes ecosystem as a whole rather than being tied to any single tool.
Precisely. And let's not forget that the principles of GitOps can be applied to other platforms as well. The idea of using Git as the source of truth and automating deployments based on changes in Git is not limited to Kubernetes.
That's a good point. So even if we decide to explore other options down the road, the knowledge and skills we gain from using Argo CD and adopting GitOps practices are still going to be valuable.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things I love about software engineering. It's a constantly evolving field. We're always learning, adapting to new challenges and new technologies.
And that's a perfect segue, I think, into the last part of our deep dive. We've tackled the challenges of sticking with Jenkins. We've explored the potential of Argo CD, but now it's time to zoom out and look at the big picture. What are some of the key trends that are shaping the future of CI/CD? And how can we prepare ourselves for the challenges and opportunities ahead. Okay, so we've spent a good chunk of time really, picking apart Jenkins and ArgoCD, but
Yeah.
the CI/CD landscape, it's way bigger than just these two players, right? What are some of the other trends that you think are going to shake things up in the world of software development and deployment?
I think one of the biggest trends is this shift toward everything as code. We talked about it in the context of, CI/CD pipelines, but this philosophy, it's really permeating like every aspect of infrastructure management and software development these days.
So it's not just about, writing code to build our applications, but like using code to define our infrastructure, our environments, even our, operational processes.
Exactly. This whole infrastructure as code approach, it brings a lot of benefits. It makes everything version controlled, repeatable, auditable, which
Mm.
is, essential when you're dealing with these complex systems. You need that consistency and stability.
And this ties in really nicely with the whole GitOps movement, right?
Yeah.
Using Git as that single source of truth for, well, for everything.
Yeah.
But let's be real for a second. A lot of organizations out there, they still rely on these, manual processes and a patchwork of scripts.
Mm.
How do we bridge that gap between where we are now and this ideal everything as code world?
Well, it's a journey, right? It's not like you flip a switch and everything's magically automated. I think the key is to start by identifying those areas where manual processes are causing the most pain.
Hmm.
Maybe it's provisioning new environments, maybe it's managing configuration changes, maybe it's deploying updates. And then you look for tools and practices that can help you automate those specific tasks.
So it's about picking that low-hanging fruit first and then gradually building up our automation capabilities. But with all these different tools and technologies popping up, it's tough to know where to even start. Where should we be focusing our efforts? Like, what are some specific skills or areas of knowledge that software engineers should be, investing in to stay ahead of the curve in this crazy CI/CD world?
Well, I think having a strong foundation in containerization technologies like Docker and Kubernetes is becoming absolutely essential. Understanding how to build and deploy containerized applications is, it's a must-have skill for any modern software engineer these days. Yeah, containers are basically becoming the building blocks of modern applications, right? And Kubernetes is the orchestrator that keeps everything running smoothly.
But it's not just about the hardcore technical skills, is it? What about the softer side of things like collaboration and communication?
Oh, absolutely. As these CI/CD pipelines become more complex and you have multiple teams and technologies involved, effective communication and collaboration, it becomes even more critical. You need to be able to clearly articulate your needs, understand the dependencies of other teams, and work together to resolve issues quickly and efficiently.
So we need to be good communicators, good collaborators, and of course, masters of automation and containerization.
Yeah.
But I think one thing we can't forget about is the importance of continuous learning. This CI/CD landscape is like a moving target, right? There are new tools, new technologies popping up all the time.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why it's so important to stay curious, keep learning, attend those conferences, read those blog posts, experiment with those new tools, and be open to new ideas. The best software engineers, they're the ones who are always learning, always pushing themselves outside their comfort zone.
I love that. So it's
Yeah.
not about, being an expert in every single tool out there,
Yeah.
but just having that mindset of a lifelong learner, always adapting, always evolving with the technology.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to challenge the status quo. Just because something has always been done a certain way doesn't mean it's the best way. Be willing to experiment. Be willing to fail to learn from your mistakes.
This has been such a fascinating deep dive. We started with a simple question, Jenkins or Argo CD, but we ended up talking about, the future of CI/CD, the importance of this whole everything is code movement, and really the essential skills for modern software engineers.
Yeah, and I think the key takeaway here is that the CI/CD landscape, it's incredibly dynamic. It's constantly changing. There's no, one-size-fits-all solution. It's about understanding the principles, evaluating the tools, and making informed decisions based on your specific needs and your goals.
So to all the software engineers out there listening, whether you're still battling it out with Jenkins diving headfirst into Argo CD or exploring, a whole other set of CI/CD solutions, just remember, stay curious, keep learning,
Yeah.
and embrace the challenge of, building and delivering amazing software in this crazy, ever-evolving tech world.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And on that note, it's time for us to wrap up this deep dive. Until next time, happy coding, everyone.